So it's COMP2084, week 13, part 2. So we've built our API, we've used scaffolding, and we've quickly tested the two get methods. So if we browse to API/products, our API returns a list of products. Now they're numbered numerically by product ID. If we wanted to modify the API, we could just add an order by if we wanted them, let's say, alphabetically. We could add an order by here, a product order by, that would sort them. And we've also tested our get single product. The same URL, we just depend on valid product ID. If we put it on an invalid one, we get a 404. When we put on a proper ID, we get a single product. So the get methods are fairly easy to test through the browser. The challenge is, how do we test the post, the put, and the delete methods? Because when we just make a standard call, HTTP call in a browser, get is always the method that runs. So that's why we've installed this Postman tool instead. So I'm going to start up Postman. And show you how this works. And Postman is actually how I'm going to evaluate and test your assignment 2, part 3. I'm going to use Postman to make get, post, put, and delete requests against your API. So when it first loads, if you don't have this screen come up right away, under the new menu, we can just make a new request. And I can click cancel. I don't want to save the request. So we just want to get to this screen. I think we could just click new tab maybe. So this is the default. If I click this drop down, I can specify which API method I want to call. And the first 5 are get, post, put. So put is used for doing updates. Patch is also an alternative method for doing update, and delete. We're not really interested in the other methods. So I want to run a get request, and then it says what URL, what API endpoint do you want to call? So I'm going to use so I'll take this URL, I'll take this out. I'll just grab that URL, my local host with my port number /API/products. So I'll just paste it in here. And it says hit send to get a response. I'm going to make a get request to my API. So it sends the request, and down here it shows me the response. I got a 200 OK response, and down below I get the data in JSON format. So the same thing that we saw in the browser, I'm now replicating in Postman. If I want to test the method to get a single product, what do I need to do? This gives us everything. Yeah, I'll just put in a valid ID on the end of my URL, and I'll make a new request. So now it gives me a single product. So I know that the get all and get one methods, both of those are working. So now I want to try to use the API to create a new product by using the post method. If we can create a new product, we can then use the put method to try and update it, and then we can use the delete method to try and delete it. And if I can successfully do all those things, well, there's your 5%. So I'm going to change my method here to post, and I'm going to take off the ID. We don't have any ID when we're adding a new product, right? The ID is going to come from the database. And then I need to click here. If we're going to post a new product, we need to provide the body. I'm going to click on this body link here. And I'll just any idea why we're working in browser but not in Postman? Pardon? Any idea why we're working in browser but not in Postman? If it doesn't work in Postman, you got to check the error response and see what it says. Rich, yep. What do you have under headers? These are just default. It's just the domain. So I haven't put anything in. Postman's just filling that in for me. We shouldn't need any headers. So if I want to post, if I click on body, there's a couple ways I can do it. I can either provide form data with keys and values, or I can choose a raw format where I can pass in a JSON object. So what I want to do is kind of copy the JSON format from down below. I'm going to create a JSON object for a new product. I'm going to provide in a name. Yep. Pardon? What's the error? So yeah, that's under File and Settings. That's what. Yes, turn off SSL certificate. So our certificate is self-signed through Visual Studio. So Postman doesn't like our certificate. It says if the SSL certificate is not from. So by default, this option here is on. So go to File and Settings, and you can turn off SSL certificate verification. So just toggle that. Thank you, Ryan. Toggle that to off. So turn that to off, and then you should be able, and try it again, then your GET request should work. So I want to try to add a new product. So my URL is just API/products. My method is post, and I've clicked on the body and then raw, and I'm going to make a new product. So I'm going to set up a name, a description. So posted from API. Price. I can put in any value. And I have to give it a category ID. This is the required foreign key. So I will just put in, category ID 3, which I know already exists. So these are the only things I have to supply. Name, description, price, and category ID. So when I submit this, I am hoping, if we look at our post method in the API, it should return a 201 created response, and it will send back the new product that will include the new product ID. If it's successful, this is what should be returned. So just set up a JSON object with the fields name, description, price, and category ID. And put in any values for these. So if I try to send this request, that's interesting. What do we get? One other thing I forgot to do over here. This option says text. I'm not sending plain text. I want to say that my text format here is JSON. So toggle this option over on the right. From text to JSON. So I want to send JSON. I'll try and submit again. You don't have to call the add method to the post. Right, hang on 1 second. Sorry, bad syntax. Yes, I missed a colon. Thank you, Joel. So it's name, colon, description, colon, price, colon. I'll answer your question in a minute, Stephen. No, that's fine. So hopefully, okay, so third time is a charm. I get an HTTP response of 201, meaning a new resource was created. Request has been fulfilled and resulted in a new resource being created. So now I have a new product, and it includes my new product ID of 1008. So if I want to check, how do I know for sure? I mean, it's a good sign. We have a new product object with a number. If I want to check it, I could now append on my new product ID up here, and now do another GET request and make sure that this returns a product and not a 404 error. So now it returns my single new product 1008 with a 200 OK response. So this is how I'm going to mark the assignment. I'm going to run get all. I'm going to try get one with a valid ID. Then I'm going to try to post a new object. Then I'm going to run a get and make sure that object got created. So Stephen, your question, how does it call add? So it calls when we run post. I'm not going to run it again, but we'll look at the method. So when we run post and pass it body, let's look at what happens. Our post method accepts a product object in as a single object. We use our context to add and save the changes. And then it returns, right, our new product that will now contain that ID. It gets populated when we call save. And it with a 201 created response. So we can create and we can read and we can create. To do an update, I need to make 3 changes to test the update. I'm going to change my method from post to put. Put will run an update. I'm going to put my ID back in because I'm not updating all the products. I just want to update my new product that has ID 1008. Let's say I'm going to change the price. It's we want to put it on sale for Cyber Monday, so I'm going to lower the price from $10.99 to $9.99. Now I need to make one more change. What other change do I need to make in my JSON body if I'm doing an update this time? So I've changed the price from $10.99 to $9.99. I've changed my method, added my ID. There's something that's missing from the JSON body that we didn't need when we added a product, but there's something we need now that we're editing an existing product. Right, we now need to put the product ID in our JSON object because we're now editing an existing. And I need to specify that it's 1008. So I'm now doing an update on this record, I'm going to modify the price. And maybe I'll update the description. So I'll now say it's updated from AP using put. So I'm going to run this put method. And then I'm going to run a get method again on 1008 so we can see whether the record got updated. Question? That's a really good question. Why don't I take the description out and let's see what happens. I'll just cut that. So yeah, what if I'm not changing the description? Do I need to include it? Good question. So I've added my ID, changed my method to put, and appended the ID onto the end of the URL. So I'll try this one. So we get a 204 response. Nothing is returned. So now I'll run the get request, and we can see what does our object look like now. So yeah. Actually, that's strange. I thought I took that. How did that happen? I took my description out. That's bizarre. So it did update both my price and my description, even though I... Okay, let's try something else. I'm curious. If I take the name out and run a put, so notice also, why did I get a 400 bad request now if you look at that product object? I tried to update it again. What's it telling me is wrong? So I got a 400 bad request. What's wrong with that request? Here I can go to the... So our model validation still works. In our product model, the name property is required. So I can't update a product without a product name. So our API is still using our validation that we built into our MVC scaffold. So the last method I want to test is delete. So if I keep my ID here of 1008, I change my method to delete and send the request. It says, okay. And now if I run my get request, what response should we get now? Yeah, we should get 404 if it's successfully been deleted. So 404 is actually the expected result in this case, because I've executed my delete statement on product ID 1008. So then when I delete it and then call get, that record is gone. So this is the exact process I'm going to walk through in testing your APIs. Can I get a list? Can I get one? Can I add a record, then update the record, then delete the record? So I'll use Postman to test all of this. So in this case, I'm testing it locally, but if you're able to deploy your API to Azure, then I can actually just put in, assignment2.azurewebsites.net/API, and I should be able to make the calls directly to the server to do this. So it allows me to modify data in your application without me having direct access to the database. I'm using your API service instead. So the code we wrote before the break is all you need for the assignment. If you want to test it before you hand it in, you can just walk through this same process with Postman to check that the scaffolding gave you 5 working methods. Should. You do not have to modify the code in your controller at all.
I know there was having APIs folder and then activities controller as a child of that, and that there was going to be no conflict with the naming.
Yes.
But I'm still getting it. My Visual Studio is telling me that it recognizes the 2 activities. In my case, it's called activities, but 2 controllers are the same name, even though they're in.
Okay. If that's the case, then what you could do in here, so you could rename this. So just, if you rename it here, it'll give you an option to say, do you want to refactor any references? So just call it products API controller. So just rename and refactor the references. If you get that, that should solve that problem. Does anybody have other questions about creating the API or testing it?
So, your product ID, if that's not an implementing field, you don't add it, right? In the request.
Right. In the post request, you don't add it. Right. In the get, update, and in the get, put, and delete, you need to add it because you have to specify which product you are selecting, updating, or deleting, but not when you're adding, because yes, we have no ID, the database will take care of the ID. And we can see that in the method signatures. So in the get one, it has an int ID parameter. And Stephen, it actually shows you the URL, right? So this get takes an ID and that will return a single product. The put takes an ID parameter. The post for creating, yeah, there's no ID here. Right, it returns it, but it doesn't take it as an input parameter to the method. And then deletes. So 3 of the 5 methods have an ID parameter. The method that gets everything has no ID, and the method to create a new one has no ID. The methods to select a single record, update a single record, or delete a single record all require the ID. So this is what part of why we want to make sure we have that identity field set to on in the database. So the database will automatically take care of it when we're posting a new one. Does anybody else have any questions about either the API or testing it using Postman? So I want to look at one last thing, and then you're either free to go or free to take a break, and then we can stick around if you want to see some of the other unit tests that we didn't have time to do. So building our API is relatively easy because Visual Studio will generate it. We may need to change it. So for example, we might want to make our API kind of a read-only version that users can see the products or a single product, but maybe they can't change them. Well, in that case, we could just remove the put, post, and delete methods from our API if we wanted to make it read-only, right? The scaffold is always a starting point, and then we modify it to suit our business needs. But if we're going to create the API, we also need to document it. So if we're making this API available, the developer of some other application needs to know what are the endpoints, what are the URLs I would have to call, and what methods do I call at each one, and what do I have to provide each method. So Spotify's documentation is pretty clear, and this is fairly standard. It looks kind of similar to what Stripe's documentation looked like. we used to have to create these things manually. So here's another example. So this was an API of another application. I had built an ASP.NET web application, and I had to integrate it. So my client, they then had this other system, another service, and they wanted the two applications to be able to integrate and share some user data back and forth. So the developer of that other application, this was their documentation they provided me. They said, here's the URL. And here is, for example, one method. So this was for sending a patient address. So this is what the JSON object would look like. And they said, here are, you know, the different keys for various phone numbers, homework, email. And here's like a sample of how you would call their API. You would do a post to this address to set up somebody's email address. And this is the response you would get back as JSON. So some developer manually took their time to spec all this out. It's a fair bit of work. And then anytime the API changes, they would have to update the document and say, here's a new copy, because now we've changed our save patient email API method. Or here is another example. This is a 14-page document of a different service that we had to integrate, where they explain all the methods and all the requests and responses in JSON format. So it's a fair bit of work to create this stuff. So a few years ago, somebody created this tool, which is super handy, called Swagger. And Swagger has fairly quickly become an industry standard tool that what Swagger can do is it can inspect your API and it'll actually generate API documents for you. So it'll generate a document that looks like this. It shows the endpoint, and then it shows the individual methods inside. And if you click on any method, it shows you this is the request, this is what a request object needs to look like, and this is what the JSON response you'll get back. So they've actually got a little demo here. So here they've got a pet store API. So this is kind of a mock API service. So if we want to find a pet by the ID, we can click on the method. This will return a single pet. And it says you supply an ID number. And we get back a 200 OK response, or a 400 or 404. And if we get an OK, this is what the JSON that comes back. So let's say we want to build a mobile app that uses the pet data from this API. Our code will expect when we look up a pet, this is the description, the definition of what a pet will look like. And we can actually try it. We don't even need Postman. We can actually try it right through the browser. So if I pass in an ID of, say, 100 and click execute, it actually says, nope, there is no pet with ID 100. I don't know. One maybe? Okay, so when we pass in pet 1, it gives me this sample response object. So now in our application, I know this is what a pet's definition is going to look like. This is all the information that I would have access to. So fortunately, there are a couple of NuGet packages for integrating Swagger into Visual Studio .NET API. So we can generate a document that looks like this for our API. So we need to install a few packages and then write a few lines of code to configure it. Now, there's a link. I've put this link up on Blackboard. We're basically following the link that's here. This documenting APIs with Swagger. That'll take us to this link. So we're largely going to follow this. It's not very long. We're going to install Swagger, and then there's two sub packages, two different packages that sit on top of Swagger to generate the actual document. One is called Swashbuckle, one is called NSwag. We're going to use NSwag and Swashbuckle. So we need to install a few packages, so we're just going to kind of go through this, and it'll give us a Swagger style documentation that's automatically generated. So the first thing we need to do, I'll just right click my web project and choose Manage NuGet Packages. And I'll click on the Browse tab, and I want to search for a package called OpenAPI. This is a Microsoft package, .NET models with JSON for OpenAPI specs. So we want to install this in the web project. We don't need it in the unit test project. We're not documenting our unit tests. We're documenting our API we just built. So search for OpenAPI and install this one, Microsoft.OpenAPI. So I'll just accept the license. Now, you do not need to do this for your assignment, but I can tell you now this will be part of the final exam. We'll be scaffold an API controller and document it with Swagger. So now we want one more package. We can search for NSwag. And what we want is this third one. We want NSwag for ASP.NET for ASP.NET Core. So it's the Open API / Swagger API toolchain for .NET. So this third item, where you can search directly NSwag.ASP.NET Core. So there are other versions. Some of these are for traditional versions of the .NET framework. This is the .NET Core specific package.
So the documentation that's produced, is that running a test on the API? Is that
Yeah, it inspects the API to see what methods are in it and what are the parameters and response type of each method. Well, if you use Swagger, I'm not requiring you to use Swagger.
If you're going to mark our assignment, you can run the documentation and it will give you.
If you include Swagger in it, then yes, I could.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll use Postman. So I'm going to install nswag.ASP.NET Core, and then we'll just kind of follow the steps in the tutorial. We basically just have to add a bit of code to our startup file to configure Swagger to run, and then it'll generate the document for us. Okay. So just those two packages, OpenAPI and nswag.ASP.NET Core. And then all of the work we need to do is in our startup file. So I'll have a quick look at what the tutorial says to do, and then we'll do that stuff. So it tells us to install the package. In configure services, we're going to need to add this method, add Swagger document. And then in our configure method, we'll need to register the Swagger generator and call the use Swagger UI. We may need to do a couple other things, but shouldn't be too much more. Okay, so I'll go to my configure services. Swagger or API documentation. We'll call services dot just to call add Swagger document. So that goes at the bottom of the configure method. Sorry, at the bottom of the configure services. We've done lots of work in here. This is where we set up Google and session support. So we'll add Swagger document in configure services. And then in the configure method down below, we'll need a little bit of code down here as well. So we've added line 81. And down at the bottom of our configure method, we have to need to use OpenAPI and use Swagger UI. We want to use Swagger UI 3, which is the latest version. We may have to tweak this a little bit. So far, we've only needed 3 lines of code. So let's build So to try this out, I'm going to go right to my root, and I'm just going to add on to my root URL /Swagger. It may need a little more configuration, but we'll try it like this. We'll see what we get. So it automatically generates an HTML page. It says here my title, so we probably want to put in a descriptive title of our API. But if we scroll down and expand, here's my products API. If I expand it, it says, okay, there's 2 get methods, a post, a put, and a delete. So if I try, so it says our first get takes no parameters. It should return a 200 response. I can try it out and execute it. So this will do what Postman does. Actually calls the API method. So it took a bit. We got a 200 response, and here is a JSON object, all the products. I can try my get single. So if I say try it out, I can pass in an invalid ID. So 1008, I know this one's invalid because I created it and then I deleted it. So if I execute this, I should get a 404, which I do. I put in a valid product and execute. I get product ID 1003. My ASUS desktop with a 200. I could try the post, put, and delete methods right from here if I wanted to. So this isn't required for part 3. You can do it if you like. If you want to practice using it, I'll definitely ask you to configure it as part of the final exam. Now I can also configure the title. It also defaults to version 1. So as we change our API, we'll want to regenerate our documentation so that anybody referring to the documentation is seeing the latest version of it and they're not making calls to old versions. So if I want to configure this a little bit, in my startup, instead of calling add Swagger document, let's see, I think I can do it this way. Hang on. Let's see. I think if we call it, actually, we'll check their documentation. Just a minute. We should be able to provide some parameters that go into the document. Okay, so yeah, if we want to customize it, we can add, we call add Swagger document, we can set up, for example, a version, our own description, the license, etc. We don't want to set up all these things, but we may want to set up a few of them. It should say Control-Alt-PC, and it should have a, at the very least, we should put in our own title and description. So in here, we'll configure it just a little bit. Oops. So we'll say our version is 1. It's got a title property. Call it Control-Alt-PC API. And we'll give it a description property. We'll just call it a product web service. So web services is kind of an old name for APIs. We hear that a lot. So I'll just build, and it should update the title and add the description to the top of our Swagger document. So part of what I'll want you to do in your final exam is use Swagger to generate the document and then add, for example, your name and student number into the title and description of the Swagger document. Just open it up again, try to shrink it down so you can see the code. So I'll just refresh it. So our title should get updated. So it now has our title here, our description. So if we wanted a more robust description of the API, like Spotify has, for example, here, you know, we can put in whatever we want for that description. It can be lengthy. Or it can be brief. And it says HTTPS only as our scheme because our web application is set up that all requests are forced. We're forcing them all to use HTTPS. So if you make an HTTP only call to the API, it will fail. Like if I go to Postman and try to do, let's say, a GET request to my API, but I don't use HTTPS. I'm not going to get a valid response because our service only runs under HTTPS. Eventually, I think this will just time out. Just let it run. So Swagger has become a huge time-saving tool because before Swagger, we spent a lot of time having to carefully document our APIs. And if we made one small mistake, like we left out one field that was required and then handed that document to another developer, they might have a problem interacting with our API. So Swagger takes that kind of human element out of it, and it makes sure that our API documentation is accurate. Does anybody have any questions about using Swagger, what it does, or how to get it to work? So Swagger is it's not a .NET tool. There's a .NET version of it, but you can use this for any sort of API. So if you want to build an API with PHP, you could. You want to build an API with Java or JavaScript, you could use Swagger for any of these in order to build your documentation. And that's one of the things about APIs is that they're all standard. They all just take JSON in and out. So for example, we go to Spotify's API. We don't even know what the back end is. It might be .NET, it might be JavaScript, it might be something else entirely. But all APIs can send and receive JSON. Okay, I'm going to push everything we've done up to Git. I'm maybe going to take a little break and step out. If anybody feels like coming back to look at the unit tests for doing create, update, and delete, we can look at those. If you have a lot of other work to do, I know it's getting towards the end of the semester, that's fine too. In that case, I'll see you next week. Okay, so I will push what we've done now, stop the stream. And I will start marking your assignments. I'll have everything marked, hopefully by the end of the week. If not, certainly before your final exam.